Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I last took up the issue of this government's commitments to Indigenous women and the environment was in November, when Amnesty International had just released a report on resource development in northeastern BC. The headlines read in following days, "In approving dam permits, Ottawa forgets its reconciliation promises." So the federal government was, what we said at the time, that the federal government had been green-lighting development projects without any consideration for inequalities and risks to women that are too often a result of mega-project development. The Amnesty International report also identified that there are no federally funded on-reserve shelters in northeastern British Columbia. So I'd like to know what the government has done since this very troubling study was released in November and we last talked about it in question period. I had the privilege of traveling to the Peace River Valley in July of last year to meet with the landowners, the Indigenous chiefs, the traditional territory of Treaty 8 nations. I met Yvonne Tupper, who is an inspiring, strong Cree activist woman who's made her home in the Peace River Valley. She wrote to me just last night, "Site C will destroy migration paths for predators and they will stay on either side of the river. Wolves, grizzly bears, wolverines, and eagles' nests destroyed. We are connected to the land. Women and young girls should feel valued, appreciated, and respected like any and all women and young girls should in BC, in Canada, and in the world. We deserve it, considering our lands are being stolen in vast cases." I also heard from Craig Benjamin, who was one of the authors of the Amnesty report. He wrote to me this week, "The thing that has really struck me from conversations with Indigenous women in Treaty 8 territory is hearing again and again that places like the lands threatened by the Site C Dam are vital healing places, and that a government committed to stopping violence against women has to be committed to standing with Indigenous women and their communities when they seek to protect those healing places." The other point we stressed in our report, he writes, is that we have had more than 2 decades of studies in Northeast BC repeatedly linking large-scale resource development to known threats to women's safety and well-being, from rising costs of living to shortages of housing and childcare to rising substance abuse and violence, all of which was quite simply ignored in the assessment of the largest resource development in the region in recent history. We heard testimony this week at the Status of Women Committee from Kathleen Leahy saying Canada has for a long time looked at infrastructure spending as its #1 solution to economic growth problems. And then she goes on, if I get time I'll read more, she goes on to describe the need to do a gender lens assessment of such spending to make sure it's going to have equal benefits for men and women, but also, most importantly, not disproportionate negative impacts on women. So through you, Mr. Speaker, I ask, what has the government done since the tabling of this Amnesty International report on the Site C Dam approvals to ensure that there will not be further federal approvals that do not go through a gender test to make sure that our most vulnerable people and environments are protected?
Well, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Status of Women.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to address the question by the honourable member for Ladysmith, Nanaimo, regarding the Site C project. In the fall of 2014, the former government approved the project and set legally binding conditions with which the proponent must apply. The federal court upheld the decision of the Governor and Council on August 28, 2015, and this decision of the federal court is now under appeal. Mr. Speaker, the validity of this decision is currently in front of the Court of Appeal and will be settled in due time. Our government is committed to building a renewed nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples that is based on recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership, Mr. Speaker. I am aware that the Amnesty International report indicates that the increased rates of violent crime and diminished access to social services have placed Indigenous women and girls at increased risk of harm while denying them the protections and support they need. There is no place for gender-based violence of any kind in this country, Mr. Speaker, whether it is committed against an Indigenous woman or any other woman. That is why the federal government is taking a series of concrete actions to address this critical issue. Mr. Speaker, across this country, some $89.9 million will be spent over 2 years for the construction and renovation of shelters and transition houses for victims of violence in provinces and territories. Budget 2016 committed additional investments for women's shelters on reserves, up to $33.6 million over 5 years and up to $8.3 million ongoing. Mr. Speaker, there are other investments that will provide women and girls better opportunities and hope for a future where they will be safer, more secure, and have better choices. Nearly $970 million for educational infrastructure on reserves, $100 million in 2017-18 towards early learning and childcare on reserve, more than $330 million for a renewed youth employment strategy, and finally, Mr. Speaker, renewal of the urban Aboriginal strategy, to name just a few. It's all part of an $8.4 billion investment, Mr. Speaker, over 5 years to improve the socio-economic conditions of Indigenous peoples and their communities and bring about transformational change. In closing, Mr. Speaker, I want to assure the House that we will honour our commitments to Canadians. We will work with Canada's Indigenous peoples and other interested parties to achieve results for all Canadians and generations to come. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll point out that it was this government, the Liberal government, that issued fisheries permits in July of this year that allowed the project to go forward. So this is entirely in this government's lap, as has been pointed out by the Assembly of First Nations Chief Perry Bellegarde, the BC Union of Indian Chiefs, Chief Philip Stewart, and many other leaders in the strongest words. Last week we heard from Margot Young at the Status of Women Committee. She said, again, talking about the disproportionate impacts on women, you must think about the gendered consequences and have a lens that allows you to access the gendered inequality consequences across a range of policy options. Really what a national gender equality strategy would allow is this kind of systematic thinking about this issue that would really make the change to women's status in Canada. So I ask again, through you, is this government going to evaluate infrastructure projects with a gender lens?
Well, thank you again, Mr. Speaker. Our government, to reiterate, is committed to gender equality and to ensuring that women and girls can live free from violence. Our government engaged with experts, advocates, and survivors across the country to develop a federal strategy to address gender-based violence. Approximately 300 individuals from over 175 organizations participated in roundtables and consultations, and over 7,500 responded to an online survey. This feedback, Mr. Speaker, from Canadians will help to inform the development of a federal strategy. We are working to create the conditions to ensure that Canada is a place where all women can reach their full potential. We look forward to launching the strategy in the coming weeks. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.